Welcome! Today, we bring you the story of Emma Collins, a bride abandoned at the altar by her wealthy fiancé, Luke, who vanishes from her life just as she discovers she's pregnant. With quadruplets. Years later, Luke reappears, determined to claim his role as a father, sparking a fierce custody battle that forces Emma to confront her past and fight for the future of her children. What will Emma do when faced with the man who left her? Will she let him back into her life, or fight to protect the world she's built for her boys? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and let us know in the comments. What would you do in Emma's situation? Now let's dive in. Emma Collins stood in the center of the bridal suite, gazing at her reflection in the ornate gilded mirror. The room was bathed in soft golden sunlight, the kind that made everything seem magical. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that this day really was a fairy tale. Her wedding dress shimmered under the light, the intricate lacework and delicate beading catching the glow just right, giving her the ethereal look she had always dreamed of as a little girl. It was perfect. Everything was perfect. Or at least it should have been. Her hands, though steady as they traced the soft folds of her gown, betrayed the tension in her chest. She swallowed hard, trying to calm the nervous energy bubbling inside her. Today was the day she would marry Luke Hayes, the wealthiest man in Boston. The man who had swept her off her feet in a whirlwind romance that felt more like a dream than real life. But today, standing there in her wedding dress with the ceremony only minutes away, the dream felt suddenly fragile. "Emma, you're glowing!" exclaimed Maggie, her best friend and maid of honor, as she rushed into the room. Maggie was the type of person who always radiated energy, her curly blonde hair bouncing as she moved, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm serious. Luke's going to lose it when he sees you. You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen." Emma forced a smile, catching Maggie's reflection in the mirror. "I hope so," she said softly, her voice betraying her nerves. Maggie paused, sensing the shift in Emma's tone. She crossed the room, taking Emma's hands in hers. "Hey, what's going on?" "You're getting married today to the man of your dreams. This is the start of your forever. No more second-guessing." Emma's smile wavered. She wanted to feel the excitement Maggie did. She wanted to believe that this was the start of her forever. But there was a knot of anxiety sitting low in her stomach, one she couldn't quite explain. I guess I'm a little overwhelmed. Everything's happening so fast, and I keep thinking that maybe—" Her voice trailed off. "That may be what?" Maggie pressed, squeezing her hands reassuringly. Emma hesitated, trying to find the right words. How could she explain the nagging doubts that had crept into her mind over the past few weeks? Luke was perfect on paper. Handsome, successful, generous. But there had been moments when he seemed distant. Moments when she wondered if he was fully committed to her, or if his mind was always on something else. The business, perhaps. His multi-million-dollar deals always seemed to take priority. "I don't know," Emma said, shaking her head as if to rid herself of the thoughts. "I think I'm just nervous. This is a big step." Maggie smiled softly, her eyes full of understanding. "Nerves are normal. It's a huge step, but it's the right one. You and Luke are perfect together. You've been planning this for months, and look at all of this." She gestured around the room, filled with flowers and ornate decorations. The epitome of luxury. "This is your day, Emma. Just breathe. It's all going to be okay." Emma nodded, taking a deep breath as Maggie's words washed over her. Maybe Maggie was right. Maybe the nerves were just that. Nerves. But as she glanced at the clock, ticking away toward the ceremony, the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. The wedding was scheduled to begin in just 30 minutes, and the flurry of activity outside the bridal suite had increased tenfold. Guests were arriving, the orchestra was tuning their instruments, and the wedding planner was barking orders to the staff to ensure everything ran smoothly. From behind the closed door, Emma could hear the hustle and bustle of the preparations, but in the silence of her suite, it all felt strangely distant. She was supposed to feel elated, she reminded herself, but instead, her heart pounded with an unsettling rhythm. Just as she was about to step away from the mirror, her cell phone buzzed on the vanity. She froze, staring at it for a moment. No one should be calling her right now, not with the ceremony so close. A spike of anxiety shot through her as she picked up the phone and saw Luke's name on the screen. Her stomach flipped. Why was he calling? Wasn't he supposed to be getting ready too? Had something gone wrong? Hello? She answered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Emma's heart pounded harder in her chest, and her hand tightened around the phone. Luke? I'm not coming. Luke's voice finally broke through the silence, cold and distant, devoid of the warmth she was used to. Emma's mind reeled, unable to process the words at first. What do you mean you're not coming? She whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. Surely this was a joke, some kind of sick joke. I can't do this, Emma, Luke said, his tone flat, almost robotic. I thought I could, but I can't. I need to focus on my company. There's too much at stake right now. I can't afford distractions. You'll understand someday. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. She pressed it harder against her ear as if doing so could make the words different, as if she could hear anything other than what he had just said. Luke, what are you talking about? We're getting married. You promised. Everything is ready. Everyone is here. I'm sorry, Luke interrupted, his voice emotionless. It's over. And with that, the line went dead. Emma stood frozen in place, the phone slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor. The world around her spun, the walls closing in as the enormity of what had just happened sank in. He wasn't coming. The man she was supposed to marry, the man who had promised her a life together, had abandoned her. Just like that, the life she had imagined, the future she had planned, was crumbling around her. She took a step back, her legs weak beneath her. A sob rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down, unable to fully grasp the pain that was now tearing through her chest. Her eyes darted to the clock on the wall. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 20 minutes, and she was standing here, alone, in a wedding dress, with no groom. The next moments passed in a blur. Maggie had found her first, of course. Her best friend always seemed to sense when something was wrong. The sight of Emma, pale and shaking, still in her wedding dress, was all Maggie needed to understand that something terrible had happened. Emma, what's going on? Why aren't you heading downstairs? Maggie asked, her voice tinged with concern. He's not coming, Emma whispered, barely able to form the words. He called, and he's not coming. The color drained from Maggie's face. What do you mean he's not coming? That doesn't make any sense. Maybe he's just running late or… No? Emma cut her off, her voice growing firmer as the reality of the situation took hold. He's not coming. He said it's over. Maggie's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God, Emma. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of chaos. Maggie rushed to call off the ceremony, intercepting guests as they arrived, and quickly explaining that the wedding was cancelled. The wedding planner was in tears, frantically trying to manage the disaster while Emma sat numbly on the edge of the bed, unable to process what was happening around her. Her father, Thomas, had arrived soon after. His face, usually so composed, was filled with a mixture of anger and pain as he pulled Emma into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't know what that man is thinking, but we're going to get through this. You don't have to face this alone. But in that moment, Emma did feel alone, more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The lavish hotel suite, once filled with the promise of a joyful future, now felt like a tomb, cold and empty. The flowers that had once seemed so beautiful now mocked her, their vibrant colors a cruel contrast to the darkness settling over her heart. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire. The story of Luke Hayes leaving his bride at the altar was too juicy for the media to resist. Headlines screamed from the front pages of every gossip magazine and newspaper. Boston's richest man abandons fiancée in shocking last-minute decision. Emma became the center of a media circus, hounded by paparazzi every time she left her apartment. The flash of cameras greeted her at every turn, and her face, once private, once just another person in the crowd, was plastered on every tabloid. They labeled her as the abandoned bride, a tragic figure for the world to gawk at. But the worst part wasn't the media attention. It was the feeling of complete and utter abandonment. She had been left not just by Luke, but by the life she had thought was hers. All the plans they had made, all the dreams they had shared, were now shattered. Her phone rang constantly. Friends, family, colleagues, all offering their condolences, their shock, their pity. But Emma couldn't bear to talk to anyone. She stayed locked away in her apartment, curtains drawn, avoiding the world outside. The wedding dress still hung in her closet, a painful reminder of what could have been, of the life that had slipped through her fingers. Her father visited often, trying to coax her out of her isolation, but Emma wasn't ready to face the world. Not yet. How could she, when the man she loved had walked away so easily, as if their relationship had meant nothing? It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of everything she had believed in. The weeks after the canceled wedding were a blur of confusion, pain, and unwanted attention. Every time Emma tried to go out, she was hounded by paparazzi, their cameras flashing in her face, capturing her every movement like she was some tragic celebrity. At first she had tried to dodge them, covering her face with sunglasses and scarves, hoping they'd lose interest. But they didn't. If anything, the gossip only grew more intense with each passing day. "Abandoned bride rebuilds her life," the headline screamed. "Except I'm not rebuilding anything," Emma thought bitterly. She was still sitting among the wreckage, not even sure where to begin picking up the pieces. The penthouse she had shared with Luke no longer felt like a home. It was just a shell, filled with reminders of the life they had once planned together. The life that now felt like a distant, unreachable dream. Every room, every piece of furniture, every shared memory seemed to mock her, reminding her of the future she'd lost. She couldn't bear to stay there anymore. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the uneaten dinner in front of her, she made the decision. She had to leave, staying in the penthouse, staying in Boston, staying anywhere close to Luke's world. It wasn't just painful. It was impossible. She didn't belong here anymore. She never really had. The next morning, Emma packed her bags. She didn't take much, just a few clothes, her laptop, and some personal items she couldn't part with. She left the keys to the penthouse on the kitchen counter and walked out, leaving behind the life she had once thought was hers. She found a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the luxury she had grown accustomed to, but it was hers. No reminders of Luke, no extravagant furniture, no prying eyes. Just peace, or at least that's what she hoped. Emma tried to keep herself busy. She applied for jobs, took freelance graphic design work, and did her best to ignore the constant ache in her chest. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was off inside her. She was tired all the time, more tired than she had ever been. At first, she chalked it up to stress. After all, her life had been turned upside down. But then the nausea started, hitting her in waves every morning. She couldn't even look at food without feeling sick. It wasn't until one morning, when she found herself doubled over in the bathroom, clutching the sink as the nausea washed over her, that the thought finally crossed her mind. No, it can't be. That's impossible. But the nagging suspicion wouldn't leave her. Later that day, she found herself standing in the aisle of a small convenience store, staring at the pregnancy tests on the shelf. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached for one, her hands shaking. It couldn't be. There was no way. But the feeling in her gut told her otherwise. Back in her apartment, she sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding the test in her trembling hands. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. When the result finally appeared, Emma's heart stopped. 2 pink lines. Pregnant. The initial shock was paralyzing. Emma sat there staring at the test, unable to process the reality of what it meant. Pregnant. She was pregnant. And not just with anyone's baby. With Luke's baby. The man who had walked away from her without a second thought. 1,000 emotions crashed over her at once. Fear, disbelief, anger, heartbreak. How could this be happening? How could she be carrying his child after everything he had done to her? After abandoning her on what was supposed to be their wedding day? She stood up abruptly, pacing the small bathroom. What am I going to do? The thought raced through her mind over and over. She had no job, no money, and now she was about to become a mother. Alone, completely alone. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. Emma couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything other than the life growing inside her. She thought about calling Luke, telling him the news, but every time she picked up the phone, she stopped herself. "He left you," she reminded herself. "He made his choice. He doesn't deserve to know." But as the days turned into weeks, Emma's anxiety only grew. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening to her body, to her baby. So she made an appointment with a doctor, dreading the moment when she would have to face the reality of her situation. Sitting in the doctor's office, Emma tried to steady her breathing. Her hands shook as she waited for the doctor to come in, the sterile smell of the room making her stomach churn. When the doctor finally entered, smiling warmly, Emma felt a small sense of relief. But that relief quickly turned to shock when the doctor looked at the ultrasound and said the words that would change everything once again. "It looks like you're having quadruplets," the doctor said, her voice tinged with awe. Emma's heart stopped. "I'm sorry, what?" The doctor smiled, pointing to the ultrasound screen. "You're carrying 4 babies. 4 babies." The next few days were a haze of disbelief and mounting panic. 4 babies. How was that even possible? How was she going to take care of them, raise them, when she could barely take care of herself? Emma sat on the couch of her small apartment, her hands cradling her belly, which had already started to show. The gravity of her situation pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. She hadn't planned for this. How could she have? She was supposed to be getting married, starting a new life with Luke, not raising 4 children on her own. But Luke wasn't here. He had left her, and now she had to face this alone. Fear gnawed at her, but alongside the fear was something else, an unexpected feeling of hope. She was going to be a mother, not just to 1 baby but to 4. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite the fear that threatened to consume her, there was a small part of her that couldn't help but feel excited. She was going to have a family. But the excitement was quickly tempered by the harsh reality of her situation. How was she going to afford to take care of 4 children? She didn't have a steady job, and her savings were dwindling fast. And even though she had made the decision not to tell Luke, the thought of raising 4 babies alone filled her with an almost paralyzing sense of dread. There were moments, late at night, when the world was quiet and the weight of her situation felt too heavy to bear, when Emma considered calling him. But every time she stopped herself. Luke had made his choice. He had walked away without looking back, and she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of walking back into her life now. Not when she was the one left to pick up the pieces. As the months passed, Emma's belly grew, and with it, so did her resolve. She realized that she had no choice but to be strong, not for herself but for her babies. They needed her, and she wasn't going to let them down. She took on more freelance work, piecing together enough to cover rent and groceries. She learned to stretch every dollar, shopping at discount stores and cooking meals that would last for days. It wasn't easy. Nothing about her new life was easy, but she managed. She had to. Her days were a blur of exhaustion, worry, and anticipation. She had no time to dwell on what had been, no time to feel sorry for herself. She was a mother now, or at least she would be soon, and there was no room for anything else. The day she went into labor came sooner than she expected. It was early, too early, but there was no stopping it. The contractions hit hard and fast, and before she knew it, she was being rushed to the hospital, the pain so intense she could barely think. The delivery was long and difficult. There were complications, terrifying complications that had Emma fearing for the lives of her babies. But after hours of pain and uncertainty, they arrived, 4 tiny, perfect boys, each one more beautiful than the last. Emma named them Liam, Caleb, Ethan, and Mason. She held each one in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she whispered promises to them, promises of love, protection, and a future full of hope, no matter what it took. She had never felt love like this before. It was overwhelming, all-consuming, and it filled every corner of her heart. These boys were her world now, and she would do anything to give them the life they deserved. The first few months after the boys were born were the hardest of Emma's life. Her tiny apartment was cramped, filled with the constant noise of crying babies, the smell of diapers, and the endless laundry that piled up faster than she could manage. She barely slept, waking up every hour to feed one baby, then another, until the cycle started all over again. Her body ached from the strain, her mind constantly fogged with exhaustion, but she kept going. She had no other choice. It was during these sleepless nights that Emma realized just how much she had changed. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned at the altar, no longer the woman who had once been defined by her relationship with Luke. She was something else now, something stronger. She was a mother, and that title carried a weight and power she had never known before. Still, there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when she wondered what her life might have been like if things had gone differently. What if Luke had stayed? What if they had gotten married and started a family together? What if she wasn't doing all of this alone? But every time those thoughts crept in, she pushed them away. This was her life now. And despite the hardships, despite the exhaustion, she loved her boys more than anything. They were her family, and they were worth every sacrifice she had made. 3 years had passed since that fateful day when Emma was left standing at the altar. Her life had changed dramatically since then, but in ways she had never anticipated. Her days were no longer filled with wedding plans, charity galas, or high society events. Instead, they were consumed by the boundless energy and chaos of raising 4 little boys, Liam, Caleb, Ethan, and Mason, on her own. Life was hard, but it was hers. She had carved out a small, quiet existence in her modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston. She worked during the day at a local marketing firm, doing graphic design, and in the evenings, after the boys were tucked into bed, she would take on freelance jobs to make ends meet. Every dollar counted. Though the demands of motherhood were exhausting, they had also given her a sense of purpose she had never known before. Every time her boys laughed, every time they reached up to hold her hand or called her Mommy, the weight of her struggles seemed to lift, if only for a moment. But as much as Emma loved her boys, there was one undeniable truth that haunted her every day. They looked like Luke. From their sandy blonde hair to their piercing blue eyes, they were his in so many ways. And while she had done everything she could to keep Luke out of their lives, a part of him was with her every time she looked at them. One afternoon, Emma decided to take the boys to the park. It was a sunny, crisp fall day, and the boys were restless from being cooped up in the apartment all morning. The park was their favorite place, with its sprawling green lawns and playground equipment where they could run free. As they played on the swings, their laughter echoing through the air, Emma found herself smiling. Moments like this were what made all the sleepless nights and long workdays worth it. Her boys were happy, and that was all that mattered. But then, something caught her eye. Standing across the park, watching the boys with an expression she couldn't quite read, was Luke Hayes. Her heart dropped into her stomach. For a moment, she thought she was imagining him. It had been years since she'd seen him, since the day he had walked out of her life with nothing more than a cold, dismissive phone call. What was he doing here? How had he found them? Luke took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the boys. He looked different, older maybe. His suit was still immaculate, his hair neatly combed, but there was something raw in his expression, something that made Emma's heart race with both fear and anger. "Emma?" he called softly, his voice filled with hesitation. She froze, instinctively stepping between him and her sons, her hands trembling. "No," she whispered, her voice firm despite the panic rising inside her. "You don't get to do this." Luke's gaze shifted to the boys. His boys. His face paled as the realization hit him. They were unmistakably his. The resemblance was too strong to deny. "Are they?" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the question. "They're not yours," Emma lied, the words escaping her lips before she could think them through. Luke's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between Emma and the children. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice strained. "I know they're mine." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, panic surging through her. She had worked so hard to keep Luke out of their lives, to protect her boys from the chaos and instability that his presence would bring. But now, here he was, standing in front of her, and she had no idea how to make him go away. "They're not yours," she repeated, more forcefully this time. "You left, Luke." You walked away from us. We don't need you. They don't need you. Luke took another step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. I didn't know, Emma. You never told me. She turned away, refusing to let him see the fear and vulnerability on her face. And I'm not telling you now, she said, her voice trembling. Stay away from us. Before Luke could say anything more, Emma called out to the boys, her voice bright and shaky. Come on, guys, it's time to go home. The boys ran to her, giggling as they grabbed onto her hands, oblivious to the tension in the air. Emma glanced back at Luke, her heart aching at the look of determination on his face. He wasn't going to let this go. 2 weeks later, Emma found herself staring at a stack of legal papers, her hands trembling as she read the words over and over again, unable to believe what was happening. Luke had filed for joint custody of the boys. Her heart sank. She had known this was coming. From the moment she saw Luke in the park, she had known that he wasn't going to walk away again. But seeing it written in black and white, knowing that he was going to fight for her children, it was a nightmare come to life. Emma paced around her apartment, her mind racing. How could she stop this? How could she protect her boys from a man who had abandoned them before they were even born? She had raised them on her own, worked 2 jobs, sacrificed everything for them. And now, Luke, who had walked away without a second thought he could just waltz back into their lives and play father. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But Luke wasn't just anyone. He was one of the most powerful men in Boston, with wealth and influence that Emma could never match. And he had a legal team that would do whatever it took to win. The thought of losing her boys, even for weekends or holidays, was unbearable. She couldn't let that happen. But as the legal process began, Emma realized that she was facing a battle she might not be able to win. Luke showed up to every court hearing, every mediation session, determined to prove that he was serious about being in the boys' lives. He was calm, composed, and convincing. He spoke about his desire to know his sons, to be a part of their world, and to make up for the years he had lost. Emma sat across from him, her stomach twisting with anger and fear. She didn't trust him. How could she? He had left her, abandoned her at the worst possible moment, and now he expected her to believe that he had changed, that he was suddenly ready to be a father? Every time she looked at him, all she could see was the man who had broken her heart, the man who had left her to pick up the pieces on her own. She didn't want him anywhere near her boys, but the courts didn't see it that way. They saw a man who was trying to do the right thing, a man who was fighting for his children. And Emma? Emma was just the struggling single mother, barely scraping by. She didn't have the resources Luke had. She didn't have the same stability. All she had was her love for her boys, and in a courtroom, love didn't always carry the same weight as money. The first custody hearing was grueling. Luke's lawyer, an impeccably dressed, sharp-tongued man with decades of experience, presented a case that painted Luke as a man who had made mistakes, but was ready to take responsibility. He argued that the boys would benefit from having a father in their lives, from the stability and security that Luke could provide. Emma's lawyer, a kind but inexperienced attorney, did his best to counter the arguments. He spoke about the sacrifices Emma had made, about her dedication to her sons, and about how she had been their sole caregiver since birth. But Emma could feel the doubt in the room. The judge listened, but she wasn't convinced. Not yet. As the hearing progressed, Emma felt like the walls were closing in on her. The legal jargon, the cold discussions about visitation rights and joint custody, made her feel sick. These weren't just legal terms. These were her children, her boys. When it was her turn to speak, Emma stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and began, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. Your Honor, I've been raising my sons on my own for the last 3 years, she said, her eyes locking with the judge's. I've been there for every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every milestone. I've sacrificed everything to make sure they're happy and healthy. And I've done it without any help from Luke. She paused, her voice catching in her throat. I understand that he wants to be part of their lives now, but he wasn't there when it mattered. He wasn't there when I needed him, and I'm afraid he won't be there when the boys need him. Emma's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the courtroom was silent. The judge nodded thoughtfully, taking notes, but her expression was unreadable. The custody battle dragged on for months, wearing Emma down little by little. Every hearing, every legal meeting felt like another punch to the gut. Another reminder that she was fighting an uphill battle against a man with far more power and resources than she could ever dream of. Luke continued to show up, always calm, always polite, always saying the right things. He attended the boys' soccer games, took them to the park, and slowly, agonizingly, began to build a relationship with them. The boys were too young to understand what was happening. They didn't know about the court hearings or the legal battles. All they knew was that this man who looked just like them, was fun. He brought them toys, played with them, and made them laugh. Emma hated it. She hated the way Luke could just walk back into their lives, how easily he seemed to connect with the boys, how quickly they took to him. It wasn't fair. She had been there from the beginning. She had done all the hard work, and now Luke was swooping in to play the hero. But even as her anger simmered, there was a part of her that couldn't deny the truth. The boys were happy when they were with Luke. They liked him, and that was what hurt the most. One evening, after another exhausting day of work and a long visit from Luke, Emma sat on the couch, her mind racing. She hated that Luke was winning the boys over, hated that he was becoming a part of their lives. But deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about them, their happiness, their future. Luke had hurt her in ways she could never fully describe, but that didn't mean he couldn't be a good father. It didn't mean he couldn't try to make things right. But the question that plagued her every night as she lay awake in bed was simple. Could she trust him? Could she trust Luke to stay? To be the father the boys deserved? The truth was, Emma didn't know. But for the sake of her children, she was willing to find out. The days leading up to the next court hearing were some of the most difficult Emma had ever faced. She spent each evening preparing herself for battle, poring over legal documents, going over testimony with her lawyer, and lying awake at night, wondering how much longer she could endure this fight. The boys, blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding around them, carried on with their lives. They played, laughed, and asked about their father, Luke, who had become a regular presence. And with each mention of his name, Emma's heart ached a little more. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when Luke showed up at her apartment unannounced. He stood at the door, looking both weary and determined. There was something in his eyes that Emma hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that threw her off guard. "We need to talk," Luke said softly. Emma crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I don't think there's anything left to say, Luke. We'll see each other in court." Luke shook his head. "This isn't about court. This is about them. About the boys." Her chest tightened. Every time Luke talked about the boys, it stirred something deep inside her, an anger, a fear, a helplessness. She had worked so hard to protect them, to keep their lives stable, and now everything felt as if it was slipping through her fingers. "What do you want, Luke?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Luke's expression softened. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I'm trying to do the right thing here, Emma. I've made mistakes, but I'm not the man I was when I left you. I want to be part of their lives. They deserve that." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his words stung, but she wasn't sure if she could trust it. After everything he had put her through, after abandoning her when she needed him the most, how could she possibly believe that he had changed? "You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be fine," Emma said, her voice trembling. "You weren't there, Luke. You didn't see what it was like. You didn't help me when I needed you. Now you want to play the hero because it suits you?" Luke's face hardened slightly, but there was no anger in his voice when he replied, "I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm trying to be a father. I can't change the past, but I can be here now." For a moment, the weight of his words hung between them. Emma swallowed hard, the tension in her chest almost unbearable. She wanted to scream, to tell him that he didn't deserve this chance, that he hadn't earned it. But deep down, beneath the layers of hurt and anger, there was another truth. The boys loved Luke. They were too young to understand the pain he had caused, too innocent to see the complexity of their parents' relationship. To them, he was their father, and maybe, just maybe, they deserved to have him in their lives. The courtroom was cold and sterile, a far cry from the warmth of Emma's modest home or the energy of the park where the boys played. But here, in this room, everything would be decided. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, her stomach twisting in knots as her lawyer shuffled through his papers. Across the room, Luke sat beside his attorney, his expression somber but focused. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of years of unresolved pain pressing down on them both. The hearing began with opening statements from both sides. Luke's lawyer, a sharp-tongued man with years of courtroom experience, painted Luke as a man who had made mistakes, but was ready to step up as a father. He spoke about Luke's desire to be part of the boys' lives, the resources he could provide, and the importance of a father's presence in their upbringing. When it was Emma's lawyer's turn, he took a different approach. He highlighted Emma's sacrifices, her dedication, and the fact that she had been there for her children every single day since they were born. He emphasized the bond between mother and children, the stability Emma had created for them despite her financial struggles, and the emotional impact of suddenly introducing shared custody. But as the arguments played out, Emma could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. No matter how hard her lawyer fought, there was no denying that Luke's financial advantage gave him an edge. The judge, an older woman with a serious, no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently, her face betraying little emotion. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she faced the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I've been raising my sons on my own for the last 3 years. I've been there for every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every new word they've learned. I've sacrificed everything for them because I love them more than anything in this world." She paused, glancing briefly at Luke before continuing. "I'm not saying that Luke shouldn't be part of their lives, but I am asking for the court to consider what's best for the boys. They've known one home, one parent. Suddenly introducing shared custody, it's a big change. I'm not against Luke being in their lives, but I want to make sure that this transition is done in a way that's best for them, not just for us." The courtroom was silent as Emma finished speaking. She felt the judge's eyes on her, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to hope that her words had made an impact. After hours of testimony and legal arguments, the judge finally called for a short recess before delivering her decision. Emma sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands trembling in her lap as she waited. She had no idea which way this was going to go. All she knew was that her entire life, her boys' lives, hung in the balance. Luke sat a few feet away, his head bowed, lost in thought. For a moment Emma felt a pang of something she hadn't expected. Sympathy. Luke looked like a man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And maybe in his own way, this was just as hard for him as it was for her. When they were called back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Emma's heart pounded as she took her seat, her lawyer whispering last-minute reassurances to her. But nothing could calm the storm inside her. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The judge returned to her seat, her expression unreadable as she prepared to deliver her verdict. She glanced between Emma and Luke before speaking. "Miss Collins," she began, her tone measured, "it is clear to this court that you are a dedicated, loving mother who has provided for your children under very difficult circumstances. Your commitment to their well-being is undeniable, and for that, I commend you." Emma's heart soared, but she knew there was more to come. "However," the judge continued, "this court also believes that children benefit from knowing both parents when it is in their best interest. Mr. Hayes has expressed a genuine desire to be part of his sons' lives, and while his past actions are concerning, I believe he deserves the opportunity to prove himself as a father." Emma's heart sank. She knew what was coming next. "Therefore," the judge said, her voice firm, "I am granting joint custody. The boys will remain in Miss Collins' primary care, but Mr. Hayes will have visitation rights, which will gradually increase as the boys adjust to his presence in their lives." It wasn't the worst-case scenario, but it wasn't the victory Emma had hoped for either. She had fought so hard to protect her boys, and now she would have to share them. A part of her felt like she was losing something, even though she knew the judge had tried to find a compromise. Luke's face softened with relief, though he remained silent as the judge outlined the specifics of the custody arrangement. For now, visitations would be supervised and limited to weekends. But as the boys grew older and more comfortable with Luke, the arrangement could expand. When the hearing ended, Emma stood slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She had won in some ways. Her boys would stay with her most of the time, but the reality of shared custody hit her hard. She wasn't sure how to feel. As they left the courtroom, Emma expected Luke to walk away, as he had so many times before. But instead he approached her, his expression somber. "Emma," he said quietly, "I know this isn't what you wanted, and I know I don't deserve much after what I did, but I want to do this right. For them, I don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Emma looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the man who had hurt her. But what she saw was something different, something vulnerable, even regretful. It was hard to believe that the same man who had left her at the altar was now standing here, asking for a chance to be a father. "I don't know if I can trust you," Emma admitted, her voice trembling. Luke nodded slowly. "I understand. I don't want to let them down." For a long moment they stood there in silence, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on them both. Finally, Emma sighed, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "For their sake," she said softly, "we'll try." In the weeks that followed the court's decision, life began to settle into a new routine. Luke showed up for his supervised visits, and to Emma's surprise, he was consistent. He played with the boys, took them to the park, and slowly but surely began to build a relationship with them. At first, Emma watched their interactions with suspicion, waiting for the moment when Luke would let them down. But that moment didn't come. Little by little, she saw the way the boys responded to him, the way they laughed when he was around, the way they looked at him with wide, curious eyes. It was hard for Emma to admit, but Luke was trying, and for the boys' sake, she had to let him. One evening, as Luke was leaving after a long day with the boys, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "For giving me this chance." Emma nodded, her heart conflicted. "Don't make me regret it." As the months passed, Luke continued to prove himself, though Emma's guard remained up. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not fully, but she was starting to see a different side of him, one she hadn't expected. It was during one of their evening exchanges, after the boys had gone to bed, that Luke surprised her again. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he said quietly, "but I hope one day I can earn it back." Emma didn't respond right away. She looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time since he had re-entered her life. The man standing before her wasn't the same man who had abandoned her 3 years ago. He was flawed, yes, but he was trying, and maybe that was enough. For now, "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emma finally said, her voice steady. "But I can try." Luke nodded, his expression softening. "That's all I can ask for." Years passed, and the custody arrangement evolved. Luke became a steady presence in the boys' lives, though he remained more of a visitor than a full-time father. He remarried eventually, but there was no animosity between him and Emma. They had found a way to co-parent, not as partners, but as two people who loved their children. Emma, for her part, moved on as well. She focused on her career, building her small marketing firm into a thriving business, and devoted herself to raising her boys. She dated occasionally, though no one ever filled the void Luke had left, and that was okay. She didn't need anyone to complete her. She was whole on her own. On a warm summer afternoon, Emma stood at the edge of the soccer field, watching her sons play. Liam sprinted across the grass, his face lit up with excitement, while Caleb, Ethan, and Mason cheered him on from the sidelines. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt at peace. The storm that had once threatened to tear her world apart had passed, and she had emerged stronger for it. Her boys were her world, and they had given her a strength she never knew she had. As the boys ran toward her, their faces flushed with happiness, Emma smiled, opening her arms wide. This love, this family, was all she had ever needed. After the custody arrangement was finalized, life began to settle into an uneasy routine. Emma had always been fiercely independent, but co-parenting with Luke was something new, something that required her to relinquish control. at least in small doses. It wasn't easy. She had raised the boys on her own for 3 years, and now, sharing them, even with their father, felt like giving up part of herself. The boys, though, were adjusting better than Emma had expected. At 3.5, they were too young to fully understand the complexities of the custody arrangement. All they knew was that Daddy was coming around more often, taking them to the park, reading them bedtime stories on the weekends, and occasionally picking them up from daycare. One night, as Emma tucked Caleb into bed, he looked up at her, his wide blue eyes full of innocent curiosity. "Mommy, is Daddy going to live with us one day?" The question hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She had prepared herself for the legal battles, for the arguments, and the logistical hurdles of co-parenting. But she hadn't prepared herself for the emotional questions her sons would inevitably ask. "No, sweetie," Emma said gently, brushing a strand of hair from Caleb's forehead. "Daddy has his own home, but he's always going to be in your life." Caleb seemed to accept her answer, but his little brow furrowed as he thought it over. "But why can't he live with us?" Emma sighed softly, her heart aching. She knelt beside his bed, searching for the right words. "Sometimes families live in different homes," she explained. "But that doesn't mean we love each other any less. Daddy loves you very much, and he'll always be a part of your life, no matter where he lives." Caleb nodded, still deep in thought. "Okay, Mommy." As Emma kissed him goodnight, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had fought so hard to protect her boys, but no matter what, they would always have questions. Questions she couldn't always answer. Months passed, and Luke continued to show up. Despite Emma's lingering doubts, she had to admit that he was trying. He was present for the boys in ways she hadn't expected, and little by little she saw the connection between him and his sons deepen. Luke tried to attend every soccer game, every school event, and every important milestone in the boys' lives. He asked Emma for updates on their progress, wanting to know about their favorite foods, their routines, and how to comfort them when they were upset. It was clear that he was trying to make up for lost time, though Emma still wasn't sure if she could fully trust him. One evening, as Luke dropped the boys off after a weekend visit, he lingered at the door. Emma could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but there was also something else, a vulnerability that caught her off guard. "I wanted to thank you," Luke said quietly, "for letting me be part of their lives. I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm trying to earn it. I'm trying to do right by them." Emma nodded, unsure how to respond. She had spent so long resenting Luke, so long blaming him for everything that had gone wrong, that it was difficult to see him as anything other than the man who had abandoned her. But the way he was with the boys, the genuine effort he was making, it made her question whether or not she could start to let go of the anger. "I appreciate that," Emma said finally, her voice soft. "For their sake, I hope you keep it up." Luke's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment the tension between them seemed to ease. "I will," he promised. "I'm not walking away this time." Though Luke was proving himself as a father, Emma still couldn't shake the ghosts of their past. The pain of being abandoned at the altar, the humiliation of seeing her face splashed across gossip magazines, and the years of struggling to raise 4 boys on her own, all of it still weighed heavily on her heart. Late at night, when the boys were asleep and the apartment was quiet, Emma would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of her life in her mind. She thought about the moment she had found out she was pregnant, the fear and uncertainty that had consumed her. She thought about the days spent working 2 jobs, just to make ends meet, all while caring for 4 little boys who needed her. It had been hard, harder than she could have ever imagined. But she had survived. She had done it, without Luke, without anyone. And now, seeing him come back into their lives, part of her couldn't help but feel angry. Why did he get to swoop in now when things were better? Why did he get to be the fun parent, while she had been the one carrying the load for so long? One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Emma found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at a half-empty cup of tea, her mind swirling with these thoughts. Maggie, her best friend, had stopped by for a visit and sat across from her, watching Emma with a knowing look. "You're still holding on to it, aren't you?" Maggie asked gently. Emma looked up, startled. "What?" "The anger," Maggie said softly. You're still angry at Luke, and I don't blame you. But maybe it's time to start letting it go." Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that easy, Maggie. He hurt me. He hurt us. And now he's back, trying to play the role of the father, and I'm supposed to just forget everything?" "No," Maggie said, shaking her head. "You don't have to forget. But you can't let the anger control you, Emma. It's been 3 years. You've built a life for yourself, and you've done an amazing job. But if you don't start letting go of the past, it's going to eat away at you." Emma stared at her cup, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. Maggie was right, of course. But that didn't make it any easier. Emma's turning point came one afternoon when Luke came over to take the boys to a soccer game. It had been a long day, and Emma was running behind, trying to get the boys dressed and ready to go. The chaos of 4 energetic boys bouncing around the apartment had her on edge, and she could feel herself getting frustrated. When Luke arrived, he could sense her stress. "Hey, let me help," he offered, stepping into the apartment. Emma hesitated, but she was too exhausted to argue. "Fine," she muttered, waving him toward the boys. "They're a handful today." Luke smiled, easily stepping into the role of the supportive parent. He helped Caleb find his soccer shoes, coaxed Mason into putting on his jacket, and distracted Ethan and Liam with a silly game while Emma caught her breath. As she watched him interact with the boys, Emma felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was relief. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was carrying everything on her own. When the boys were finally ready and running out the door, Luke turned to Emma, his expression soft. "You're doing a great job, you know," he said quietly. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until that moment. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. As Luke left with the boys, Emma stood in the doorway watching them go. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to let Luke in. Forgiveness didn't come easily for Emma. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time. Small moments of trust, shared parenting responsibilities, and seeing the genuine effort Luke was making. But slowly, she found herself beginning to let go of the resentment that had weighed her down for so long. One evening, after another weekend visit, Luke stayed behind for a few minutes while the boys played in the living room. Emma was cleaning up the kitchen, and Luke, uncharacteristically quiet, lingered near the door. "I've been thinking," Luke said finally, his voice hesitant, "about everything, about how I left. I know I've said this before, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For what I did. For how I hurt you." Emma stopped what she was doing, her back to him. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again, especially after all this time. But there was something different in his tone this time. Something that felt sincerer. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Luke continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I just needed to say it. I needed you to hear it." Emma turned slowly to face him, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. She had spent so long holding on to her anger, her pain, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to let it go. But now, standing here, looking at Luke, looking at the father of her children, she realized something. She didn't need to hold on to it anymore. "I do forgive you," Emma said softly, her voice steady. "Not for you, but for me. I've been angry for a long time, Luke, and I can't carry it anymore. So yes, I forgive you." Luke's eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment he was speechless, but then he nodded, his expression softening with relief. "Thank you," he whispered. As the months passed, the new custody arrangement became the new normal. The boys thrived, adjusting easily to the changes. They loved spending time with their father, and Emma began to see that Luke's presence was a positive influence on them. They were happier, more secure, knowing that both of their parents were in their lives. Emma and Luke settled into a co-parenting rhythm, one that was surprisingly peaceful. There were no more heated arguments, no more tension-filled exchanges. Instead, they communicated openly, worked together to make decisions for the boys, and, for the first time in years, Emma felt a sense of calm. One afternoon, as Emma watched the boys play in the park, she found herself smiling. They were running, laughing, chasing each other with unbridled joy. And in that moment, Emma felt a deep sense of peace, a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Her life had changed so much since the day Luke had left her at the altar. She had been through heartbreak, loneliness, and unimaginable struggles. But she had also found strength, resilience, and love in the most unexpected places. And now, as she watched her boys grow and thrive, she knew that everything had been worth it. Years later, Emma stood in the doorway of her home, watching as the boys, now older, more independent, ran toward her after a weekend with their father. Luke stood nearby, smiling as he waved goodbye to them. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine years ago, a scene that had once seemed so far out of reach. But now it was her reality. As the boys rushed inside, their laughter filling the air, Emma looked out at the sky, her heart full. She had found peace, not just with Luke, but with herself. She had rebuilt her life, stronger and more resilient than ever. And she had learned that, no matter how difficult the journey, she was never truly alone. She had her boys, she had her strength, and she had a future full of hope. As Emma stood at the threshold of her home, watching her children run inside with laughter and joy, a soft smile played on her lips. She had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. And though life had its challenges, she knew now that love and perseverance could carry her through anything. If Emma's story moved you, if you believe in the power of resilience, love, and personal growth, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that will touch your heart and remind you of the strength within us all. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. And if this story resonated with you, give it a thumbs up. Thank you for being part of this journey. We can't wait to share more with you. See you in the next story.